Postmaster General Louis DeJoy returned to Capitol Hill Monday to testify on the growing concerns over mail delays ahead of the presidential election. DeJoy continued to defend the agency's ability to handle and sort mail-in ballots. He also fielded multiple questions regarding his admitted loyalty to President Trump. The testimony comes after the Democratic-led House passed legislation on the weekend to allocate $25 billion to the USPS. The bill would also reverse operational changes the agency has made since DeJoy assumed office in June, but it's unlikely to pass the Senate. CBS News chief congressional correspondent Nancy Cordes joins me now. Nancy, nice to see you again. So Louis DeJoy began his testimony with a promise that the Postal Service will do everything it can to deliver mail-in ballots securely and on time. We're less than 70 days out from the election. Has he outlined any specific plan to ensure this will happen before the election?
Well, he did say that he would ensure, Elaine, that postal workers could work overtime if they needed to in the final weeks leading up to the election. He promised lawmakers that mail-in ballots will be treated on par with first-class mail, in some cases even get priority over first-class mail. But beyond that, he hasn't really said much about how he is going to make sure that mail-in ballots do get to their destination on time, that there isn't a lag. And Democrats are clearly very suspicious about what is going on at the Postal Service. Nothing that DeJoy had to say in this House hearing really assuaged their concerns that there is a slowdown in mail service that doesn't need to be taking place, and the fact that they're still missing so much data that would explain where things stand right now, what led DeJoy to make the changes that he made in the first place. That has left them very concerned that there is going to be a slowdown in November. Republicans, on the other hand, argue that this is all overblown. They say that everything that DeJoy is doing is simply to save money and to make sure that USPS stays solvent. So the two sides really looking at completely opposite sides of the coin at this point.
Well, DeJoy was also asked specifically about mail sorting machines that have been removed from use over the past few weeks, and I want to play an exchange between him and Democratic Congressman Stephen Lynch. Let's listen.
Will you put the high-speed machines back?
No, I will not.
You will not?
Will not.
You will not. Well, there you go.
All right, so Nancy, why is the Postmaster General so opposed to reinstating these machines?
That is a great question, Elaine, and one that he really hasn't answered to Democrats' satisfaction. On one hand, he has been saying that he is not the person who decided to remove so many of these sorting machines, hundreds around the country, in the first place. And yet, at the same time, he's saying that it was the right thing to do and that he's not going to go back on it. He says he hasn't looked into who decided to do it and why, which means that he doesn't have all the facts, even though he is the person who runs the Postal Service, and yet he is insisting that it was done because those machines aren't needed, and so therefore he's not going to reinstate them.
Well, the chair of the House Oversight Committee, Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney, is threatening to subpoena Louis DeJoy if he doesn't turn over internal USPS documents on mail delays dating back to June when he took over the agency. What does the committee hope that will accomplish? Well,
they want to understand two things, Elaine. First, they want to know what it was that led him to make the changes he made in the first place. What kind of data was he relying on? He has declined to share that with them. Remember that Louis DeJoy only took over as Postmaster General in mid-June. He had never worked for the Postal Service before. That's fairly unusual for a Postmaster General. He had run a transportation delivery company, came in from the outside, and within a month he was making fairly major changes, not only to operations, but really reorganizing the entire reporting structure of upper management to him. And so Democrats believe that those were fairly radical changes for someone to make who's only been on the job a few weeks. They want to know what kind of information he relied on to make those changes. And then what they also want to understand is where things stand right now. They were able to get some internal USPS documents over the weekend, not from DeJoy, but from other individuals, that shows that there was a slowdown, a pretty marked slowdown in mail delivery that lasted at least a month starting in mid-July. But that data cuts off in early August. So while DeJoy told lawmakers that actually last week was a pretty good week and things are starting to bounce back, they don't really have any proof of that. All they know is that they're hearing from hundreds of constituents who say they're not getting their mail, they're not getting their medications, and what they really want to know is how big the problem is. And since DeJoy himself is declining to hand over that information, they're now threatening to try to get it some other way.
Right. It sounds like that data is critical. Well, the U.S. Postal Service is, of course, an independent government agency. The Postmaster General is not typically a partisan position. But, Nancy, how politicized has the office of the Postmaster General become? And what could this potentially mean down the road?
It's become incredibly politicized incredibly quickly. It really isn't a job that is typically handed out as a plum position to some presidential friend or fundraiser. But in this case, not only is DeJoy a major donor to the president, he was actually one of the top donors back in 2016, but he came in late in the process. The Postal Service had hired an executive search agency to gather names of individuals who might be appropriate to run the Postal Service. DeJoy was not one of them. He was brought in by a fellow Republican on the Board of Governors late in the process after many people had already been interviewed. So he was a late ad, according to David Williams, who was the vice chair of the Board of Governors, just resigned in April because he was so upset by what he saw happening. He said DeJoy was nowhere near the strongest candidate and yet somehow ended up with the job at the end of the day. And so it raises a lot of red flags for Democrats, as does the fact that DeJoy still has millions of dollars worth of investments in companies that compete with the U.S. Postal Service. DeJoy said in the hearing that he has no conflict of interest, that he has followed all the ethics rules at the Postal Service to the letter, and that if there is anything wrong with what he's done, that either the ethics office or an inspector general at the Postal Service would uncover it. So he says he can do his job and that it doesn't matter that he supports the president. And he frankly broke with the president in the hearing several times. He said he does believe that mail-in ballots are safe and he's going to do everything he can to safeguard them, even though the president, as you've been discussing, has repeatedly railed about mail-in balloting and has all kinds of theories about how it's going to ruin the election.
All right, a lot of people are learning a lot more about the leadership of the U.S. Postal Service, probably not something most of us thought of before this time. Nancy Cordes, thank you so much for bringing some clarity to this. Really appreciate it.